The year was 1565, and the sea carried with it both fear and possibility as the Spanish ships approached the unfamiliar coast of Florida. The decks were crowded with weary men, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and sailors who had survived storms, hunger, and the endless blue desert of the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Mateo Alvarez stood near the bow of the San Pelayo, the wind pushing back his long dark hair as he studied the shoreline. Towering trees, thicker and taller than anything he had seen in Spain, formed a wall of green along the coast. Strange birds circled overhead, calling out in sharp cries. Everything around him hinted at mystery, danger, and opportunity. Beside him, Father Rodrigo clutched his wooden cross, whispering a prayer under his breath. Mateo knew that this unclaimed wilderness would test every man who stepped onto its soil. When the settlers came ashore, the humid air pressed against their skin like a heavy blanket. The sand was soft beneath their boots, and insects buzzed around them relentlessly. They were far from the stone streets of Europe. Here, each step felt like walking into the unknown. The men dragged crates of supplies, food, tools, gunpowder, timber planks, from the boats while guards kept watch, unsure of who or what might emerge from the woods. The Spanish flag was raised proudly, but there was no cheering. Everyone understood they were standing at the edge of survival, not celebration. Within days the settlers built rough shelters with palm leaves and wooden posts. Fires burned constantly to keep away the swarms of mosquitoes. Food was rationed. Some men fell sick from the water, while others grew restless and afraid. At night, the forest came alive with unfamiliar noises, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, drumming sounds the Spaniards could not identify. Mateo spent those nights walking from post to post, comforting his men, reminding them that their mission was to establish Spain's permanent foothold in this new world. He carried the pressure of responsibility like a weight across his shoulders, but he never let the men see his fear. It was during one of those nights that the Timucua people observed the Spanish camp from the shadows of the trees. They had been watching since the first day, judging whether the newcomers were friend or foe. Their leader, Chief Saloy, ordered that there be no attack unless the Spaniards threatened them first. Days passed with the two groups observing each other silently, until finally, a small Timucua delegation approached the Spanish camp in broad daylight. They were tall, strong, painted in earth-colored patterns, carrying gifts of dried fish, fruits, and intricately woven baskets. The Spaniards, tense and uncertain, presented beads, metal tools, and cloth in return. The exchange was peaceful, but everyone could feel the fragile tension beneath their polite gestures. Life in Saint Augustine began with cooperation and caution. The Timucua people taught the settlers about local plants, how to avoid poisonous berries, and how to navigate the marshes. They taught them where freshwater springs were hidden between the trees and how to track small animals for food. But misunderstandings came easily. A misinterpreted gesture could cause suspicion. A missing tool could spark blame. Mateo spent countless hours negotiating peace with Chief Saloy through translators, determined to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He believed this settlement must survive, not for glory, but for the generations that would follow. As hurricanes battered the coastline, the settlers clung to their shelters while the wind roared like a monster through the forests. Timber cracked, roofs flew away, and rain flooded the camp. Many believed they would not live until morning. But when the storm passed, they rebuilt. Each disaster made them more resilient. They repaired the fort, strengthened the walls, and dug deeper into the earth to stabilize their buildings. Slowly, their fragile colony began to look like a true settlement. Months turned into years. Ships arrived occasionally with more soldiers, supplies, and families who wished to start a new life. The settlement grew into a community with children, gardens, workshops, and a small chapel where Father Rodrigo held Mass each Sunday. Mateo, older now and worn by countless battles with nature and despair, often climbed the wooden watchtower in the evenings. From there he could see the ocean stretching endlessly to the east and the forest stretching endlessly to the west. Between these two vast worlds stood St. Augustine, a small but determined mark of human courage. Every scar left by storms, sickness, or conflict told a story of survival. And as Mateo watched the sun sink into the horizon, he realized they had done it. Against all odds, their settlement had endured. St. Augustine had become more than a Spanish outpost. It had become a symbol, a living testament to resilience, hope, and the human desire to build something that lasts. Its foundations, carved from sweat and struggle, would stand for generations, long after the first settlers had returned to dust. Mateo closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, knowing that history would remember the footsteps they had taken on this once unmapped shore. The English ships Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery pushed through the wide mouth of the James River in 1607, carrying men who believed they were about to step into a land of riches. They imagined gold lying beneath the soil and rivers filled with jewels. Among them was Edward Carter, a young carpenter with rough hands, a hopeful spirit, and little understanding of the hardships ahead. As he stepped off the ship, he breathed in the thick, warm air of Virginia. The forests were dense, the river calm, and the silence unsettling. There were no villages welcoming them, no signs of treasure, just wilderness stretching out in every direction. The settlers quickly realized they had underestimated the dangers. Their first priority was to build a fort, and Edward worked tirelessly with his tools, helping raise walls of sharpened logs that enclosed a small triangular space. Inside were storage huts, crude houses, and a church. Outside the walls, uncertainty lurked. The Powhatan Confederacy controlled the land around them, and although initial encounters were cautious, trust was fragile. Communication was difficult, and every misunderstanding risked bloodshed. Edward did not want war, he simply wanted a chance to build a better life. But the land was unforgiving. Summer brought disease. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, carrying sickness that spread through the colony like wildfire. Many men fell ill with fever and chills, and the brackish river water made matters worse. Food supplies ran low, and arguments broke out daily over rationing. Edward sometimes sat near the edge of the fort at night, sharpening his tools while staring out at the dark forest. He wondered whether he had made a mistake leaving England. Yet each morning, he forced himself to keep building, keep working, keep hoping. Captain John Smith eventually brought order to the chaos. His strict rule, "He who does not work shall not eat," changed everything. Men who once refused to labor began digging wells, planting crops, and repairing structures. Under Smith's leadership, relations with the Powhatan fluctuated between cooperation and conflict. Trade brought corn and food during peaceful months, but violent confrontations erupted whenever tensions rose. Edward witnessed both goodwill and hostility. He saw Powhatan warriors approach with gifts one season and arrows the next. Survival depended on constant negotiation, patience, and readiness. The harsh winter of 1609 became known as the Starving Time. Snow fell thick and merciless, wildlife disappeared, and the Powhatan sealed off access to food. The colonists suffered hunger so severe that many did not see spring. Edward, thinner and weaker than ever, forced himself to continue repairing roofs, building fires, and maintaining hope. When new English ships arrived with fresh supplies and reinforcements, the settlers felt reborn. Edward watched the newcomers unload crates of tools, seeds, and weapons, and for the first time in months, he believed Jamestown might survive. Everything changed when John Rolfe introduced tobacco. The plant grew well in Virginia's soil, and soon fields of tobacco stretched beyond the fort, offering wealth none had imagined. Edward helped build drying barns and storage houses, his carpenter skills more valuable than ever. Ships now arrived loaded with new settlers, farmers, craftsmen, and families searching for opportunity. Jamestown transformed from a struggling outpost into a thriving colony. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown. Forced into labor on tobacco plantations, their suffering became the foundation of the colony's growing wealth. Edward, troubled by what he witnessed, often questioned whether the prosperity they were building was worth the cruelty imposed on innocent people. Yet the colony continued to expand, driven by profit, ambition, and the unending hunger for land. By the late 1600s, Jamestown had grown far beyond Edward's imagination. Houses lined the riverbank, farms stretched across the land, and ships came and went regularly, connecting Virginia to the wider world. The colony faced new conflicts, rebellions, political struggles, and battles with native tribes whose lands were increasingly taken. Edward lived long enough to see Jamestown rise from a desperate settlement to a bustling English society filled with children, churches, markets, and plantations. One evening, now an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, Edward stood by the river where he had first stepped ashore decades earlier. The water reflected the golden colors of the setting sun. Behind him were the sounds of life, children laughing, blacksmiths hammering, women talking as they prepared food. He remembered the starving days, the nights filled with fear, the constant threat of arrows, and the moments when everything seemed lost. He remembered the friends buried in the cold ground of the early winters. But he also remembered the victories, the rebuilding after storms, the friendships formed, and the feeling that they were creating something that would endure beyond their lifetimes. Edward watched a new ship docking at the pier, carrying settlers who looked just as hopeful and uncertain as he once had. He realized that Jamestown, with all its complexity, pain, courage, conflict, survival, ambition, had become the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could imagine. The colony, shaped by human struggle and determination, was now part of the foundation of a nation.